Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirla Greenwald. This is a Sicha from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Parshas Vaeschanan, Sicha Alef. And the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha we learn about the mitzvah of Shabbos in the Aseres HaDibros. And this Sicha is a Siyum Maseches Shabbos. And there are 4 parts in the Sicha. The Rebbe will, number 1, present the final Mishnah of Maseches Shabbos and ask a question on the order of a detail that's taught in that Mishnah that relates to the Malacha of Kshira. Number 2, go into an extensive discussion comparing and contrasting the malachas of Kshira and Hitzah. Number 3, based on this, answer our question. And number 4, present in Pnimis Inyanim the meaning of the beginning and end of Maseches Shabbos. In regards to the Dinei Shabbos, that Shmiras Shabbos is one of the Aseres HaDibros, which are written in our Parsha, so the Mishnah at the end of Maseches Shabbos teaches, Umaise b'mei aviv shel Rabbi Tzadok, uv'mei Abba Shol ben Botnis. There was a story that occurred in the days of the father of Rabbi Tzadok, and in the days of Abba Shol ben Botnis, shepakaku es amar b'tofiach, that they shuttered the window with an earthenware flask. So they would close the window with something outside of it, and over there they used an earthenware flask. V'kashru es amekeda begemi, and they also tied an earthenware vessel with a strand of reed grass. And they did this leida im yesh bagigis poiseach tefach oy loy. They did it in order to determine whether there was in this barrel, earthenware barrel, the opening of a tefach or not. So the incident over there was that there were 2 houses side by side, and in between there was an alley, and in the alley there was someone who was passing away. And so the halacha is that if there is a cover over the alley, then it contains the tumah, and the tumah will then enter into the windows that are also under that covering of the houses that are on the 2 sides. And that's indeed what was there at the time. There was a barrel, an earthenware barrel that covered the alley, and in the earthenware barrel there was a little hole. Now if the hole is more than a tefach by a tefach, then the tumah will actually escape through that hole, and it will not extend to the sides into the windows of the houses. So they saw that this person was on the verge of dying. So what they did is they put an earthenware flask by the window. They shuttered the window with this earthenware flask, so that if there wasn't a hole in the barrel on top of that alley, then the tumah would not enter into the window, because they put a flask there. They put it with the bottom of the flask pointing outwards so that the tumah would not enter. And then afterwards they tied a piece of earthenware vessel that was the size of a tefach by a tefach. They tied it on a piece of reed grass, and they did that in order to measure whether the hole in the barrel that covered the alley was bigger than a tefach. And if it was bigger than a tefach, that means the tumah would escape, and the windows would be fine. They wouldn't have to have them shuttered. And the Mishnah there concludes, Umidivrayim lamadnu shepoikikim umaydidin v'kaishrim b'Shabbos, that from their words we learned that you could shutter, you could measure, and you could tie in Shabbos, because they shuttered the window with the earthenware flask. They measured to see the size of the hole in the barrel that covered the alleys, and they tied the mekeda, the earthenware vessel, with a piece of reed grass. So meaning that on Shabbos one is allowed to shutter a window with an unattached board, a person is allowed to measure, and to tie a kesher she'enei shel kayama. It wasn't a permanent tying, because we used reed grass, which could be used to feed animals, so it wasn't something which was permanent. Now in the Gemara it's explained that only measuring of a mitzvah is permitted, and also in regards to tying a knot, it's explained in Shulchan Aruch that only if it's for a mitzvah may a person tie a kesher uman, which is a proper tie that's not kayama, it's not shel kayama, it's not there to remain, which that would be asur min haTorah. So the measuring and the tying of the knot are only permitted if it's for a mitzvah. However, regarding shuttering the poikikin, which is like building, the issue with poikikin would be that it's an issue of baineh. So it's explained in Tosfos that it's permitted even if it's not for a mitzvah. So we have over here 2 categories. We have the moedidin and kaishrim, which are only permitted for a mitzvah, and we have the poikikin that's permitted under all circumstances, even if it's not for a mitzvah. And the question is, the reason why the Mishnah first says Paikikin and then Umaydid in Vikaishrim, in the conclusion, the Mishnah says Umidivrayim Lamadnu She Paikikin, and then it says Umaydid in Vikaishrim. So the reason the Mishnah says Paikikin before Umaydid in Kaishrim, so we can say very simply, is because first Pakik was Amar. That's the first thing they did. They shuttered the window, and afterwards they were Kashru and Madadu. So it's understood why the Mishnah concludes by saying Paikikin before Moedidin and Kaishrin. But according to this, that it's an order of what occurred, it should have said Vikaishrim and then Umaydidin. It should say Divrayim Lamadnu, Shapaikikin, that's the first thing they did. And then it should say Vikaishrim and then Umaydidin. Because first Kashrus Amakeda, first they tied the earthenware vessel with the reed grass. And afterwards, and through that, once they already had that in place, Madadu, they measured to know Imesh Bagigis Paisech Tevach, if there was a opening of a tefach in the barrel that covered the alleyways. So in terms of the order that the things were done, it was first Pakuk was Amar, then Kashrus Makeda, they tied the earthenware vessel, and then they were Madadu, to see if there was a hole in the barrel over the alley. So the Mishnah should have said, Lamadnu, Shepoikikin, Vikaishrim, Umaydidin b'Shabbos. And so the question is, why does the Mishnah say Maydidin before Kaishrin? The question continues, and even if you say that the reason Paikikin is said first is because of the rule, which is learned from Taisvis, that when there are two words, or two teachings, they are organized in a way of zu, ve'ein tzarech lemar zu, meaning first the bigger chiddush and then the smaller chiddush. First we say zu, this one which is a greater chiddush, and we don't even have to mention the next one which is a smaller chiddush, and therefore it's understood that the din that has the greater chiddush has to be taught first. And Paikikin is the greatest chiddush, since they permitted it even when it's not for a mitzvah. Like we said, Paikikin is because of an issue of baineh, and they permitted it anyway, and we explained that from Taisvis that it applies even when there's no mitzvah involved. So you could say that the reason Paikikin is said first is not just because that's the order of the events, but also because it's the greatest chiddush, whereas they only permitted Maididin and Kaishrin when it's for a mitzvah. The problem with that is that won't answer why Maididin is before Kaishrin, because the chiddush in both of them is the same, that both of them are permitted. And so the order, if it's not going to be based on which is a greater chiddush, since the chiddush in both of them is the same, it should be based on the story. And actually, it seems like there is a bigger chiddush in Kaishrin being permitted than in Maididin being permitted. So from the perspective of which is a greater chiddush, also from that perspective, it seems that Kaishrim should be taught before Maididin, because there's a greater chiddush in the Kaishrin than in the Maididin. Because the Isser of Maididin is Mipnei Shu Maisachel Vilzilzul Shabbos. It's not in any way connected to an actual malacha. It's just that it's a weekday activity, and therefore it's a way of not treating Shabbos respectfully. It's disrespectful to Shabbos for a person to be occupied with such a weekday activity of measuring things. Whereas the Isser of Kaishrin, by a Kesher She'enishal Kayama, when it's not permanent, like in this case over here, is because, and only in such a way, that medivrei seifrim nikrazeh gamkein shel kayama, that midrabanon, this is also considered a kesher shel kayama. Meaning, what does it seem like we're saying here? That it's similar to a kshira deiraisa. So permitting kaishrin, which is similar to a malacha deiraisa, is a greater chiddush than permitting maididin, which is only a maisachel and zilzul Shabbos. So also from that perspective of which is the greater chiddush and should be taught first, kaishrin should have been taught before Maididin. So we're going to go now into a side discussion, and based on that, we're going to come back and answer our original question. So this will be understood by first explaining what we learned in the Mishnah in the beginning of Maseches Shabbos, that the malacha of Eitzah is only aser midiraisa if the person does an akira and hanacha. But otherwise, if the person doesn't do the akira and the hanacha, the person just does the akira and then passes into the other rishus, or the person just brings it into the rishus and does the hanacha, then it's only aser midivrei seifrim. And it's known the question on this. Why isn't Haitzah also Asr Midiraisa with just an Akira or just a Hanacha? Because it's a Chatzi Shir, which is Asr Midiraisa by Shabbos. So Chatzi Shir, for example, would be something which isn't kosher. Now, only if a person ate the minimum shir do they get a punishment. However, even if they ate less than the minimum shir and they don't get a punishment, it's still Asr Midiraisa. And so the question is, also by Haitzah, why don't we say that the whole malacha where a person gets punished for it is if they do the akira, the Haitzah, and the hanacha? But also if they do a chatzi shir of it, for example, they did just the akira and the Haitzah, or just the Haitzah and the hanacha, so although they won't get the punishment, it's still asr min hatera, because chatzi shir is asr min hatera, and that idea of chatzi shir being asr min hatera also applies by Shabbos. And it's explained to answer this question on the basis of the wording of this rule itself, the rule of Chatzi Shir. What do the words Chatzi Shir mean? They mean that the only thing that's missing is the Shir, which is the quantity of the Isser. But there's nothing missing in the essence and quality of the Isser. Like in the example of something which isn't kosher, it's the very same thing which isn't kosher, and the only difference is the amount of that thing that the person ate. However, if there's something missing in the essence of the Isser, then the Torah did not answer that. When we say the Torah made a Chatzi Shir Asr, it means if the only thing that's missing is the Shir. But if something is missing in the very essence and quality of the Isser itself, then the Torah did not answer that. And so too here, just an Akira or just a Hanacha are half of a Malacha, and not a Chatzi Shir. It's not that the whole Malacha is there and part of the Shir is missing. The actual Malacha itself is not there. It's not a whole Malacha if there's just an Akira or just a Hanacha, and not both of them. And we can say similarly regarding Shira, that also by a Kesher She'ene Shel Kayama, which is the Kesher of our Mishnah, where it's missing the end and completion of the Malacha of Kshira, which is the Maisa Uman, the Maisa Uman part, because the person isn't tying it al dashi sharkain kol zman she'efshar le'liyes kayam, and the person's not tying it that it should remain that way as long as possible, as long as it's able to be. So we can ask, why isn't it asr midiraisa because of chatzi shir? And the answer is similar to by Haitzah, that it's not a chatzi shir of the quantity of the malacha. It's not that you have the whole malacha, but a part of the quantity is missing. But rather, it's chatzi shir of the essence of the malacha itself, because the da'as she'ishar kain, the intention that it should remain this way, is part of the essence of the malacha, and therefore it's not asr midiraisa. So we're just bringing this concept that it's not asr midiraisa from Haitzah to Kshira, when there's something that's missing. By Haitzah, it's either the Akira or the Hanacha, and by the Kshira, it's the Das Sheishar Kain Kol Zman She'efshar Le'liyes Kayim, that it should remain that way, that it should be permanent, as long as it's able to remain that way and be permanent. Now we're going to move on to a side question. So it's not a question that's directly on what we just learned, but it's a question that comes up after we establish what we just said. So however, according to this, we need to understand, by the malacha of Haitzah, if there's just an Akira or just a Hanacha, we don't find that it's permitted for a mitzvah. And so the question is, why by Kshira in such a way, we do find that it's permitted for a mitzvah, like we said at the end of Maseches Shabbos, and for Haitzah, in the very same way, we don't find that it's permitted for a mitzvah. Both of them are missing part of the essence of the malacha. So why is there this distinction? And it's actually explained in Mefarshim that the reason the Mishnah at the beginning of Maseches Shabbos teaches the malacha of Eitzah by an ani and balabayas, which involves the mitzvah of tzedakah, is to teach us that this Eitzah that's missing the akira or anacha is also asr even when it's for a mitzvah. And so the question is, why is there this distinction that the Eitzah, when it's missing part of the essence of the malacha, is not permitted even for a mitzvah, whereas the kshira, when it's missing part of the essence of the malacha, is permitted for a mitzvah? And we can say that the reason for the distinction is that even though both of them, the Haitzah without the Akira and Anacha and the Kesher She'en Shel Kayama, are both of them are also Medivrei Seifrim, nevertheless the reason for the Isser isn't the same. By the hitzah with just an akira anacha, the reason for the isser is because gzeira shema yavayu kol echad ve'echad mehem lasis malacha shlema b'Shabbos. It's a decree because we're concerned that each and every one of them could come to do a complete malacha on Shabbos, and therefore the Chachamim made it usher. And so it's from those things that the Chachamim were usher, so that a person doesn't come to do an isser skila. However, by the kesher she'eni shel kayama, the reason it's aser is because medivrei seifrim it's called a kesher shel kayama, since it's going to last a certain amount of time. So we're not concerned it's going to bring to a kesher shel kayama. It's just that medivrei seifrim it's called a kesher shel kayama, and so it's from those things the chachamim are aser, since they are similar to a malacha. And since the isser to make a kesher she'eni shel kayama isn't because of a gzera that a person may come to an isser deraisa, and it's just because it's similar to an isser deraisa, so therefore we can distinguish and say that it's different when it's for a mitzvah. When it's for a mitzvah, the chachamim permitted it. But this is not so by Haitzah with just an Akira or Hanacha, where the isser is because of a gzera that a person may come to an isser deraisa. And so since there's something of a greater concern over here, it makes sense that it's usher even when it's for a mitzvah. So over here we're distinguishing between a haitzah with just an akira or a nacha and a kesher she'eni shel kayama. Despite what we said is similar about them, that both of them are only a chatzi malacha, but in what makes them usher, it's different. By the haitzah with just an akira or nacha, what makes it usher is because we're concerned that it will bring to an isser skila. So that's a much higher level of severity. Whereas by the kesher she'eni shel kayama, what makes it usher is that it's similar to a kesher shel kayama, but it's not that we're concerned it's going to bring to a kesher shel kayama, and so therefore it's not as severe. And that would be an explanation for the distinction why by a kesher she'eni shel kayama they permitted it for a mitzvah, and by hitzah with just an akira anacha they did not permit it even if it's for a mitzvah. Once we have this answer in place, we now have a side question on this, and that is, however, this itself needs to be explained. Why indeed didn't the Chachamim make a gzera also by a kesher she'eni shel kayama and say that since it's a half a malacha, we're concerned that a person may come to an isser skila? Just like we say by Hitzah, since it's a half a malacha, we're concerned a person may come to an isser skila, and so it should be usher even when it's for a mitzvah, like we said. That if the reason something is usher is because we're concerned that it'll bring to an isser skila, then it won't be permitted even by a mitzvah. That's what we said about Eitzah. Why don't we say the same thing by a kesher she'eni shel kayama? That the Chachamim would make it usher because it may lead a person to an isser skila. And if that would be the explanation, then it would be usher even when it's for a mitzvah. And it's a kal v'chemer actually. If the Chachamim made a gzera by an akira or a nacha alone, where it requires another action to come to a complete malacha, you need to add an action of the akira or the anacha. So certainly they should make a gzera by a kesher she'eni shel kayama, where it only requires the das she'ishar kein la'im, the das just has to be changed to be a complete malacha. So if the Chachamim made Haitzah with just an Akira Nacha Aser because of the reason that it may lead to a complete Malacha, why didn't they say the same thing by the Kesher She'eni Shel Kayama? That it's Aser because of the concern that it'll lead to a complete Malacha. And if we would say that, then just like by Haitzah, we say that it's not permitted even when it's for a mitzvah, also the Kesher She'eni Shel Kayama will not be permitted even when it's for a mitzvah. So we can explain that the reason the Torah was only Eiser, a Kesher Shel Kayama, is because the Malacha of Kshira, the definition of the Malacha is to make a Chibur v'ichur of two things, to combine two things, take two things and combine them into one. And it cannot be called a true Chibur v'ichud unless it was made in such a way she'ishar kein la'elam. Meaning what we're saying is that the das, that it should be a Kesher Shel Kayama, that it should be she'ishar kein la'ilam, is a condition in the malacha of kshira. It's not a part of it, like a bunch of parts and one part is missing, but it's a condition to turn this into the malacha of kshira. And therefore, if the person originally made the kesher, that it should only be for a certain period of time, and then to untie it, then even when they are tied together, it's not a true chibur ve'ichud, and it's not defined and categorized as kshira, which the Torah was eiser. So this is not kshira. According to this, it's understood that without the das, that it should be a kesher shel kayama, the das she'ishar kein la'ilam, it's not that it's missing a part of the complete action of the malacha, like the akira is missing or the hanacha is missing, one part is missing. But rather, it's not the malacha of kshira in the first place, since the strings aren't truly tied and connected. And it's only an act of bringing close and touching the strings. This is not considered kshira. It's not kshira with a missing part. It's not kshira at all. And since it doesn't even have a little or part of the malacha, which the Torah was Eiser, so therefore they didn't make a gzera that maybe from doing part of it, a person will come to do all of it, because this is not part of it. Now it's understood that the reason that the Chachamim nevertheless made it Aser, if it's not even part of it, is only because externally it's similar to the malacha of Kshira in the Torah. And that's why it's permitted when it's for a mitzvah, because it's not based on this much more severe decree that from doing part of it, a person may come to do the whole of it. This is unlike Haitzah with just an Akira or Hanacha, where the definition of the malacha in the Torah is the act of Haitzah, taking it from one Rishos to another Rishos. And then there's a bunch of parts to it. There's the Akira, there's the Hanacha. And so if the person's missing just the Akira or just the Hanacha, they still have the Malacha of Haitzah missing a part. So then the Chachamim made a Gzera, that if the person did the Malacha and they're missing a part, we're concerned that they may come to do the whole of the Malacha. And since that's the basis of the Isser, so since the basis is that it may lead to a whole Malacha, which is something very severe, therefore the Chachamim did not permit it even when it's for a mitzvah. And now, based on all of this, we can go back to the beginning of the Sicha and answer our original question. Because essentially what we did throughout the entire Sicha, from when we started this side discussion, was to understand what is the Isser of making a Kesher She'ein Shel Kayama. And based on this understanding, we will now be able to understand why Kaishrin is mentioned last in the Mishnah. It says Paikikin, Umaydidin, V'Kaishrim. And we asked, why is Kaishrim last? According to our current understanding of the Malacha of Kshira, we can answer that question. According to this, it'll also be understood why the Mishnah says Maididin and then Kaishrin. And we have Kaishrin on the right and Maididin on the left, because that's how it is also in the question. So we explained that in a Kesher She'ein Shel Kayama, that the Chachamim were Eiser, there's no part of the Malacha of Kshira which is in the Torah. It's not the Malacha of Kshira, and there's no part of that Malacha in the Kesher She'ein Shel Kayama. And the Isser is only because it's similar to the Malacha of Kshira in the Torah. Meaning that the Isser isn't because of the act of Kshira, because this is not the act of Kshira, but rather only because it's similar to a Malacha, the Malacha of Kshira that is in the Torah, without having any connection to that Malacha at all. Meaning that if not for this similarity, there would be no reason to make it Aser, because it has no part of the Malacha of Kshira. Whereas the action of Medida, even though it's not Aser because of any connection to a Malacha that is Aser in the Torah, not to a part of it, and not to being similar to it, doesn't have part of a Malacha in the Torah, it's not similar to a Malacha in the Torah, but rather its whole basis is only Midirabanan, so in a way it's lower than any other type of problem on Shabbos. But on the other hand, this itself indicates that it's being Aser is because what it itself is. Shehu Maisachel v'Zilzul Shabbos. It is. That's what it is. A Maisachel and Zilzul Shabbos. And for this reason, it makes sense that Medida, that is Aser because of itself, is more strict than Kshira. Because Kshira doesn't have anything inherent in it that's problematic. It's just similar to a Malacha in the Torah. Whereas Medida has something in it that's inherently problematic, that it is a Maisachel v'Zilzul Shabbos. And therefore, when the Mishnah comes to teach that both of them are mutter for a mitzvah, there's a greater chiddush in Medida that it is mutter, even though it itself is a Maisachel v'Zilzul Shabbos, then that Kshira is mutter, that it itself is really nothing problematic whatsoever, and it's just what it's similar to. And therefore the Mishnah teaches Maididin, that it's permitted on Shabbos for a mitzvah, and then it teaches us the smaller chiddush of Kaishrin, that it's permitted on Shabbos for a mitzvah. The explanation in Pnimis Inyanin for the order of Paikikin, Maididin, V'Kaishrin will be understood by first explaining why it says Paikikin, Maididin, V'Kaishrim in the present, and as a certainty that Paikikin is something which is present and Paikikin is something which is certain, and it doesn't say Mutter Lifkaik, it's permitted to do this. So it's explained elsewhere that the reason in Pnimis Inyanim why Maseches Shabbos begins with the Malacha of Eitzah is because in Ruchnius it's a general and fundamental aspect in all the Isurim of Shabbos. Through doing a Malacha, which is Asur, a person is doing the act of Eitzah. A person is taking out from Rishus HaYachid, which is from the Rishus of Yechidei Shel Olam, and the person is taking it out into Rishus HaRabim, into the Turi de Pruda, which is the Olam HaKlippos. And that's why the Malacha of Eitzah comes as a general introduction to all the Dinei Shabbos. It's telling us that's really in essence what all the Malachas are. They're an action of taking something out of the Rishus HaYachid, the Rishus of Yechidei Shel Olam, and taking it into the Rishus HaRabim, the Turi de Pruda, the Olam HaKlippos. Similarly, it's also true regarding the end of the Maseches, that everything goes after the conclusion. We look into the conclusion to see a deeper message that relates to everything, that it explains there at the very end the general effect that happens through the general Shmiras Shabbos with all its details. There it's going to give us the general effect that happens through Shmiras Shabbos. Continuing along, we're going to put a few more pieces in place before we come back to explaining about the order of Paikik and Maidid and Vaeschanan. So it's explained in a number of places the difference between the 3 times of Shabbos. We have the night of Shabbos, Maila Shabbato. We have the day of Shabbos, Yom de Shabbato. And we have the Raiva de Raivan, the time of Mincha of Shabbos. So by the night of Shabbos, it says there is Aliyas HaMalchus from Biyah to Atzilus. During the weekdays, Malchus goes down to Biyah to be Mevarer Berurim. And on the night of Shabbos, it goes up from there to Atzilus. And since the worlds receive from Malchus, so at this time, Malchus, the way it's in Atzilus, shines in Biyah. Afterwards, on the day of Shabbos, a higher level, that of Zoh, the Midas of Atzilus, shines in Biyah. Not just Malchus, the way it's in Atzilus, but Zoh, the Midas of Atzilus. And afterwards, at the time of Raiva de Raivan, an even higher level is revealed, which through this higher level, there is the yichud, the unity of Zoh and Malchus. Like we learn in many places that in order to combine 2 levels, you have to have something higher than both of them. And that's why in Shemoneh Esrei, by Ma'ariv of Shabbos, we say Veinuchu Va, which refers to Malchus, which is feminine. And in the day of Shabbos, we say Veinuchu Vai, which refers to Zoh, which is masculine. And by Mincha Shabbos, we say Veinuchu Vam, both, because we have the yichud, the unity of Zoh and Malchus. So therefore it says Vam in the plural. Continuing with this theme, so since on the night of Shabbos there's Aliyas HaElamos, that Malchus, the way it's in Atzilus, shines in Biyah, so therefore all the klippos are bottled on the night of Shabbos. Because during the weekdays, so since Malchus goes down to Biyah to do Berurim, so the klippos have a Tfisas Makim, because they're in Biyah where there's klippos, and therefore they aren't bottled. Whereas in Shabbos, so since Malchus goes up to Atzilus, which Atzilus doesn't have any Ra, like it says, Lo Yegurcha Ra, so therefore the world is in a state that the klippos are bottled. However, it's understood that the Aliyas HaElamis and the bittul of klippos is connected and dependent on the avodah of a person. Like we generally say that everything that happens has an aspect where it's dependent and it's connected to the avodah of a person. And therefore, Rizal said regarding the avodah of a person that's related to Shabbos, that nasa shutuf lakadosh baruch hu b'maaseh bereishis, that a person becomes a partner to Hashem in the creation of the world. So among the explanations of this Maimer Rizal, that Nasa Shutuf LaKadosh Baruch Hu b'Maaseh Bereishis, is one based on the Maimer Rizal that Ruach Tzfeinis Eina Mesaveves, that the northern part of the world isn't surrounded, which means in the heavens it's not complete on the Tzafin side, on the northern side. Which what this means is that in the creation, the side of Tzafin, which represents Klippus, as it says Mitzafin, from the Tzafin Tipata Chara, that's where there is the Ra. the klippus. So it means to say that that side is open. What does it mean that it's open? Meaning that there's place for klippus. However, on Shabbos, when through the avodah of a person, Malchus goes up to Atzilus, and the klippus are bottle, so then it's as if we are sealing the side of Tzafin, and the creation is complete. And that's what it means when it says that Nasa Shutuf LaKadosh Baruch Hu b'Maaseh Bereishis. And this Nasa Shutuf LaKadosh Baruch Hu b'Maaseh Bereishis, this Aliyas HaMalchus occurs right at the start of Shabbos through Kabbalahs and Shmira Shabbos. Afterwards, as a reward for this Avodah, we rise higher on the day of Shabbos to the revelation of the Ur of Zah of Atzilus. And after this, we rise even higher, all the way to the revelation of the Ur that is higher than Zah and Malchus, and that unites them. According to all of this, we understand why the end of Maseches Shabbos, which means the end of doing the Avodah of Shabbos, which are all included, like we said, in the Malacha Vaitzah, comes the Haidah, the proclamation about the three Aliyos as a reward for this Avodah. And they are hinted to in the words Paikikin, Umaydidin, Vikaishrin. And like we said, it's in the present, and it's something which is a certainty, because what to represent is something which is ongoing every Shabbos. And the order is first Paikikin, then Maydidin, and then Kaishrin. On the night of Shabbos, there's the Aliyas HaElamus and the Bittul HaKlippus, which through this we seal, which is the word Paikikin. Paikikin is to shutter, to seal the window. We seal, we are Paikik, the opening on the side of Tzafin, because Malchus goes up to Atzilus and there's no more Ra. On the day of Shabbos, we reach the revelation of the Midas of Atzilus, and Midas is connected to the word Maididin. And by Mincha of Shabbos, we rise to the level of Kaishrin, that the air which is higher than Zah and Malchus and unites them is revealed. It's Kaisher, Zah, and Malchus. And through this, it also connects all the worlds to make them all one Rishus. Like we said, that's the goal, a Rishus HaYachid for Yechidei Shel Olam.